Returning again to the words of Senator Fulbright, we find this most revealing book by him entitled Old Myths and New Realities. And bear in mind that this was written by the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of the most influential legislative committees in Washington. Now, on page 25, Senator Fulbright has this to say: "The problem for American policy is not in defining what we would like. It is rather how to live with the best we can get." And then on page 87, he continues, "The concept of national sovereignty has become in our time a principle of international anarchy. Our survival in this century may well turn out to depend upon whether we succeed in transferring at least some small part of our feelings of loyalty and responsibility from the sovereign nation to some larger political community." And then again he repeats back here on page 108, just so that no one misunderstands what he's trying to say. "The sovereign nation can no longer serve as the ultimate unit of personal loyalty and responsibility." Well, I think it's pretty obvious that many of our leaders in Washington long ago have transferred substantial portions of their personal loyalty and responsibility from the sovereign nation of the United States to the larger political community called the United Nations. In their own minds, it's likely that they consider themselves to be citizens of the world first and citizens of the United States second.
There have been differences between America and Europe. No doubt there will be differences in the future. But the burdens of global citizenship continue to bind us together. A change of leadership in Washington will not lift this burden. In this new century, Americans and Europeans alike will be required to do more, not less. Partnership and cooperation among nations is not a choice. It is the only way, the one way, to protect our common security and advance our common humanity.
In any decision where the interests of America are in direct conflict with those of the larger political community, you can be sure that America will wind up on the short end. Our former Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, in a lecture at Ohio Wesleyan University entitled "Toward World Unity," phrased it this way: "What I initially propose involves an organization dedicated to the general welfare, the peace and order of mankind, and the assuming of an allegiance to this goal superior to that of any national allegiance." Well, returning again to the words of Walt Rostow, our former chief of the State Department Policy Planning Division, we find an unusually open and frank summary of the objectives of the grand design spelled out in his book, The United States in the World Arena, which incidentally was subsidized by the CIA. Way back here on page 549, Rostow says, "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this residual right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore an American interest to see an end to nationhood, as it has been historically defined." Well, Justice of the Supreme Court William Douglas wrote an essay entitled "The Rule of Law in World Affairs," published in 1961 by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, which in turn, of course, is financed by another of those tax-exempt foundations, the Fund for the Republic. On page 32, Douglas wrote, "There is no reason for us to get tangled up in legalisms that march inexorably to the conclusion that total and complete sovereignty must be retained. For we now know that when that claim is pressed by all nations, everyone faces extinction in a nuclear holocaust." Well, that's a pretty precise summary of the grand design. In just 2 sentences, we're told that it's either world government or the bomb. Take your choice. By the way, the general theme and purpose of that pamphlet was to generate public support for increasing the power and prestige of the UN World Court, and also to lend support to a drive at that time for the repeal of the Connolly Amendment. Now, without getting too involved in this, I should explain that when the Senate ratified the UN statute of the International Court of Justice and agreed to commit the United States to accept the final decisions of the UN World Court, it was generally understood that the court would never meddle into our purely domestic affairs. But there were some who feared that in time the World Supreme Court would begin to find legalistic ways to declare that what we think is strictly our own business and no one else's is in a larger sense also the concern of mankind. So to prevent the World Supreme Court from extending its jurisdiction into our local affairs, the same way in which the federal Supreme Court has gradually assumed jurisdiction over what was once considered to be the local affairs of our own states, the Senate voted for an amendment to the statute proposed by Senator Tom Connolly. This amendment still stands and simply says that what is or is not a domestic affair of the United States will be determined by the United States, not by other nations or by the World Court itself. And so it's understandable why the grand designers have felt the need to generate greater public support for the International World Court and to repeal the Connolly Amendment. Now, on April 4th, 1960, Vice President Richard Nixon issued a statement under the official seal and letterhead of his office. And this statement read in part as follows. Many well-intentioned people have raised the basic question, why have an international court in the first place? The answer, in its simplest and bluntest terms, is that even nations that are friends are bound to have disputes. If those disputes are not settled by negotiation, the only alternative left is to settle them either by force or by law. At a time when the use of force means unleashing nuclear weapons which would destroy civilization, all sensible people agree that we must find some alternative to force for settling international disputes. Now, that's really an incredible statement because, in passing, we should keep in mind that law also is force. If the courts don't have the police and the armies to back up their decisions with force, if necessary, then there's no law. Law is force, legalized. And so, with this reality in mind, Mr. Nixon's statement continues. There are some today who believe that the prospect of the use of atomic weapons to settle international disputes is so terrible that we should set up a new all-powerful world organization which would have jurisdiction over disputes between nations. I disagree with this approach. I believe that rather than setting up a new international institution, we have to begin to use the one we already have. And then Vice President Nixon continues in his statement and concludes with strong assurances that we have nothing to fear and much to gain by repealing the Connolly Amendment. The international institution we already have, of course, is the United Nations. Most Americans good-heartedly accept the UN as a kind of farcical debating society. But I can assure you that the grand designers have other thoughts and plans. The May 1964 issue of the official UN Monthly Chronicle contains these glimpses into the future through the eyes of Secretary General U Thant. If we are to make the next step toward world authority and then onward to world government, it will be by the growth in authority and prestige of the United Nations and the International Court. Some form of regulatory international machinery of government in the true sense of the word is required. Such an authority cannot merely consist in a paper constitution and must be based in a certain degree of power. Well, a certain degree of power doesn't sound very menacing, but just how much power would it take to make the vision of a world government come true? Well, obviously, it would take whatever amount is required to be superior to that of any political subdivision beneath it. It would have to be so powerful that no nation could be able to challenge it without risking nuclear annihilation at the hands of the UN Army. But of course, if that happened, no one could possibly object because it wouldn't be called an act of war. It would be a peacekeeping maneuver by a peacekeeping force, and the mushroom cloud would rise from a peacekeeping bomb. Now, I know this must sound fantastic to some of you, so let's get back to the record. In 1961, the State Department published Document 7277, a booklet entitled Freedom from War, and the subtitle explains what it really is: the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. Now, this was our proposal submitted to the General Assembly of the United Nations for disarming and transferring to the UN complete control over our atomic weapons, our missiles, and our national Army, Navy, and Air Force as well. Everything except what we might need for a limited internal police function. Now, after 18 pages of detailed proposals, we finally discover in plain language the ultimate goal of our disarmament program. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a direct quote. Disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Well, of course, 1961 was a long time ago. And it's true that State Department publication 7277 is no longer our official position on disarmament. It was replaced by this one, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency publication, number 4, General Series 3, and as you can see, it's entitled Blueprint for the Peace Race. On page 33, we find the new position. The parties to the treaty would progressively strengthen the United Nations Peace Force established in Stage 2 until it had sufficient armed forces and armaments so that no state could challenge it. And so it has gone, year after year, revision after revision. The basic objective of our disarmament proposals has been and is today the objective of the grand design, the creation of a true world government with sufficient military force to compel all nations, including our own, to obey. The January-February issue of Vista magazine, published by the United Nations Association, featured an exclusive interview with former President Eisenhower dealing with exactly this subject. The reporter, Mary Kersey Harvey, a senior editor of McCall's magazine, wanted to get the President's reaction to a proposal by Grenville Clark, which would establish a permanent UN World Army. After outlining the Clark proposal for President Eisenhower, here is what Miss Harvey reported. The President studied the above plan quickly, and, as I had expected, caught the ball and began to run with it. You'd have, he began to plan out loud, world marshals comparable to our U.S. marshals backed by armed forces. Non-compliance with UN law, and you send in the UN forces. He orchestrated this point at some length. And, too, he hammered away, the UN needs nuclear power. He bore down hard on the word nuclear. Take this example, he hurried on. You have two countries in a border argument. The UN orders the matter to be taken to the International Court. One or both of the disputants refuses to submit to compulsory arbitration. The UN, which by now has in its possession a fleet of submarines armed with nuclear warheads deployed around the world, orders one of the submarines to proceed to the area. The world is then told that if firing breaks out for any reason whatsoever, a tactical nuclear weapon will be delivered onto the disputed territory. If this threat fails to prevent armed conflict, you back it up with action. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the grand design for preventing nuclear war.